St. Paul, Minnesota. The capital of the state, it is also well known for being a great place to watch trains. In this video, we run around the capital city of Minnesota and see some of the train action the city has to offer. We visit Dayton's Bluff, the Union Depot Railview picnic area, and some other railroad crossings southeast of Dayton's Bluff, and see the rail action from Canadian Pacific, BNSF, Union Pacific, Amtrak, and even the Twin Cities and Western Railroad. We also go to Union Depot itself and see Union Pacific 4014, the big boy, on display there as well. And to finish our video off, we then go down the Wisconsin side of the Mississippi River and see some BNSF action as well as some Amtrak action, along with some other cool things along the way. So now, let's get into the action and see the trains in St. Paul, Minnesota. The date is July 18th, 2019. The day prior, my dad, brother, and I traveled from Mason City, Iowa to St. Paul, Minnesota, chasing the Union Pacific Big Boy 4014 on its great race across the Midwest. On this day, we'd spent it by running around the city of St. Paul looking for trains. One of the first places we were able to find some train action was at the famed Dayton's Bluff, located just east of the city. Dayton's Bluff is a cliff area located in Indian Mounds Park in the suburb of Dayton's Bluff. Both the suburb and the cliff area are named after Lyman Bluff, an early pioneer real estate operator who owned exclusive properties and built his home on the bluffs here in the early 1850s. From the bluffs, you can not only get great views of the city itself, but also of the riverboat traffic, cars, trains, and even airplanes as they either take off or land at the nearby St. Paul Downtown Airport, just across the Mississippi River. Here, we see a private jet as it makes its final approach to the runway. After the jet landed, we then saw a trackmobile shunting some grain cars at the CHS Inc. facility, also across the river.
Yeah.
As I said, you can see most everything from Dayton's Bluff, including St. Paul Union Depot. On display there was Union Pacific 4014, which we'll go and see later. We then caught BNSF 7099 and 8121, a pair of GE ES44C4s, as they were shunting a cut of autorack cars from the nearby BNSF Dayton's Bluff yard. While the BNSF engines are stopped here, let's take a look at the track arrangement here. Using this map, the tracks in orange are BNSF, the tracks in red are Canadian Pacific, and the tracks in yellow are Union Pacific. We are at Dayton's Bluff, highlighted on the map. Starting with BNSF, they operate the Midway Subdivision. The Midway Sub runs from Dayton's Bluff Yard to BNSF's WFE Northtown Yard, just due north of Minneapolis. Canadian Pacific also has trackage rights on this line as well. Speaking of Canadian Pacific, CP operates the Merriam Park Subdivision, which runs from CP's St. Paul Yard to the Short Line Bridge, which crosses the Mississippi River just southeast of Minneapolis. Once across the Short Line Bridge, the Merriam Park Subdivision then belongs to the Minnesota Commercial Railroad, which operates the remaining part of that line all the way to East 46th Street, also southeast of Minneapolis. Most mainline traffic on the Merriam Park Subdivision doesn't go to the Short Line Bridge, as CP trains get off the Merriam Park Sub at the subdivision's namesake Y, just east of the Short Line Bridge. There, CP trains get onto the Minnesota Commercial Railroad for a short distance north, to where their trains then get on to BNSF's Midway Sub to reach their other lines just north of Minneapolis. For Union Pacific, they have their Albert Lea Subdivision, which runs from here south to Mason City, Iowa, the Mankato Subdivision, which runs from here to Butterfield, Minnesota, and the Altoona Subdivision, which runs from here to its namesake city in Wisconsin, not to be confused with the more famous Altoona, Pennsylvania. Union Pacific uses trackage rights on BNSF and Canadian Pacific to connect their railroad lines, and Canadian Pacific also has trackage rights on Union Pacific, mainly on the Albert Lea and Mankato subdivisions. And speaking of Union Pacific, we then caught a short UP freight train led by what I believe to be a pair of rebuilt EMD SD40Ns. The only engine I was able to figure out its number on was Union Pacific 1868, the trailing unit. It was built in 1972, originally as an EMD SD40-2 for the Union Pacific, originally as 3126. As the Union Pacific engines continued their journey up the line, the BNSF pair began to shove their cut of autorack cars back into Dayton's Bluff yard, possibly to the autorack loading facility located in the yard. After the two trains got by, I then looked at the Amtrak tracker and noticed that train number 8, Amtrak's Empire Builder, was approaching St. Paul. The Amtrak tracker is a website online that allows the general public, particularly people using Amtrak, to track their trains. Rail fans such as myself also use the website to catch Amtrak trains as well. In order to catch the Empire Builder, we moved to the Eagle Parkway Railroad crossing along Shepherd Avenue just southwest of downtown St. Paul. Here, Union Pacific's Mankato Sub connects with Canadian Pacific's Miriam Park Subdivision. Amtrak uses Canadian Pacific's Miriam Park Subdivision to get to St. Paul Union Depot. We now watch as train number 8, the Empire Builder, runs by us as it makes its final approach to Union Depot. The train was being led by Amtrak number 19 and 817. Number 19 is a GE P42DC built in 1996, and 817 is a GE P40DC built in 1993. Once the Empire Builder got past, we then went back to Dayton's Bluff because I wanted to see train number 8 as it passed the bluffs. When we got back here, we found the tugboat Itasca as it was arranging some barges on the Mississippi River. The Itasca was built in 1973 by the Rayco Shipbuilders and Repair Company in Bourg, Louisiana. The tug was originally built for the Twin Cities Barge and Towing Company, but was later sold to Upper River Services, Inc. in 1984. The Itasca made news in 2018 when the tugboat was refurbished and its 2 old engines and its 2 old generators were replaced with newer and more eco-friendly engines and generators. Thanks to the refurbishment, the tugboat can now operate with a higher horsepower and use less fuel, at least according to the Star Tribune of Minneapolis. While we were watching the tugboat, we then saw an eastbound BNSF intermodal train on the Midway Subdivision. It was being led by BNSF 6541, 3725, 961, and Canadian National 2333. we were watching the intermodal train, the Itasca began to push a barge up the Mississippi River. Getting back to the intermodal train, BNSF 6541 and 3725 are both GE ES44C4s. BNSF 961 is a GE C44-9W, built in 1996, still wearing its Heritage 1 paint scheme, and Canadian National 2333 is a GE ES44DC. After the intermodal train got by, we then looked at the Union Depot and noticed that the Empire Builder was leaving the depot, and we got to watch as train number 8 passed Dayton's Bluff. The next train to come by the Bluffs was an eastbound BNSF grain train led by BNSF 7915, a GE ES44DC built in 2010, and 6017, a GE ES44AC built in 2006. As the grain train slowly entered into BNSF's Dayton's Bluff yard, we got to watch 3 of the 4 modes of transportation as they ran in sync with one another. As the Itasca, the grain train, and the automobiles continued to move, BNSF 7099 and 8121 rolled through Dayton's Bluff, still shunting the auto rack area of Dayton's Bluff yard. As the rear end of the grain train was approaching, we could see another one of BNSF's GE ES44C4s on the rear. Just like with the UP rebuilt EMD SD40N, I was unable to get the number of this engine due to the line of autorack cars on the other track. After the grain train got past, we then watched as the Itasca arranged another set of barges on the Mississippi River. As the Itasca pushed its load upriver, BNSF 7099 and 8121 began to pull forward towards the signal bridge. Dayton's Bluff is definitely a great place to watch trains at, but please remember, this is a cliff area, and there are no handrails or guardrails here, so make sure to watch your step. Take great caution if you guys ever visit this area. Also, this area is a bit of a windy area, so be prepared for gusts of wind to come by now and again. Other than that, this is a great place to watch train action here in St. Paul. After the Autorack train came to a stop, we then decided to go visit the St. Paul Union Depot. Thanks to the visit of Union Pacific 4014, Union Depot was hosting its own train expo in celebration of the big boys' visit to the city. Many vendors were there, including some model railroad clubs, and we got to watch as some of the model trains ran around the layouts. After walking around the Union Depot Hall, we then went down to the platforms to see the Union Pacific Excursion train and UP Big Boy number 4014. 4014 was on its great race across the Midwest tour, which had the Big Boy running a whistle-stop excursion across the states of Wyoming, Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. The tours Union Pacific 4014 was running were in celebration of the 150th anniversary of the completion of the United States' first transcontinental railroad. Besides the Midwest tour, 4014 also did the Great Race to Ogden back in May and was scheduled to do the Great Race across the Southwest later that fall. Not only was it amazing to see the giant here at Union Depot, but also knowing that we had chased this giant on a 3-day odyssey from Omaha, Nebraska, all the way to here, making it even more special. I featured that chase in my 3-volume series, Union Pacific 4014, The Big Boy, the run from Omaha to the Twin Cities. If for some reason you haven't seen that video yet, I highly recommend going to check it out after this video. Anyway, after seeing Union Pacific 4014 here, we then went over to the Union Depot Rail View picnic area. Here, this small park provides a great viewing area to see more train action here in St. Paul. We then got to watch as a Twin Cities and Western train heading westbound over BNSF's Midway sub came on by. Making up the power of the train was Twin Cities and Western 2011, 2010, and 2016. All 3 engines are rebuilt EMD GP38-2s. 2011 and 2010 are ex-Norfolk and Western GP38ACs, numbered 4119 and 4104 respectively, and 2016 is an ex-Southern Railway GP38, numbered 2749. All 3 of them were originally high hoods. After watching the Twin Cities and Western train roll through, we eventually made our way southeast of the city. At the West Point Douglas Road / Belden Boulevard Railroad crossing in Cottage Grove, Minnesota, we then caught an eastbound BNSF empty iron ore train led by BNSF 6117 and 9296. At the rear end of the train acting as DPU power was BNSF 6191. Also take note of some of the iron ore cars, as some of them are labeled for BNSF's predecessor, the Burlington Northern. I'm not quite sure on why this train didn't blow its horn. This might have been one of those quiet zone railroad crossings, and as you'll see later on, we saw another train here that also didn't blow its horn. Anyway, BNSF 6117 and 6191 are both GE ES44AC, 6117 being built in 2006 and 6191 being built a year later. 9296 is an EMD SD70 ACE, built in 2008. Although we are observing a BNSF train, we are on Canadian Pacific's River Subdivision, which runs from CP's St. Paul Yard all the way to La Crescent, Minnesota. Despite having their own trackage into St. Paul, which we'll see in a minute, BNSF has trackage rights on the river sub from its Dayton's Bluff yard to a junction just north of Hastings, Minnesota. After the iron ore train got by, we then went back north a short way to the Arrowwood Park at the corner of 20th Street and 7th Avenue in Newport, Minnesota. Here, I got up onto the trail bridge that connected Arrowwood Park and Dogwood Park across both the tracks and the highway, and saw a westbound Canadian Pacific ethanol train as it passed underneath the trail. Canadian Pacific 9804 and CEFX 1038 are both GE AC44CWs, both built in 2004. Also, despite Canadian Pacific also having its own trackage into St. Paul, they also use trackage rights on BNSF's St. Croix Subdivision, which is the double track in the foreground. BNSF's St. Croix Subdivision runs from Dayton's Bluff Yard to La Croix, Wisconsin, and Canadian Pacific uses trackage rights on the line from its St. Paul Yard to the junction just north of Hastings, Minnesota. Also, if you look at some maps, you might notice that BNSF also has another subdivision here called the St. Paul Subdivision, which shares trackage with both the St. Croix sub and the Midway sub, from the junction just north of Hastings, Minnesota, to University Avenue in Minneapolis, Minnesota. To make life easier, I'll just refer to this line as the St. Croix Subdivision. After the Canadian Pacific ethanol train got by, we then went to go get dinner. After dinner, we then found ourselves at the corner of 7th Avenue and 15th Street, where we found a surprise from the past. At the head of the train was BNSF 1458, still wearing its classic Cascade Burlington Northern paint scheme. BNSF 1458 is an EMD SD60M, built in 1991 for BNSF's predecessor, the Burlington Northern Railroad, as their 9281. Despite the BNSF merger in 1995 and the engine's renumbering to 1458, it has still retained its classic Burlington Northern Cascade Green, black and white paint scheme, along with its classic BN logo. Right behind 1458 was BNSF 1463, another ex-Burlington Northern SD60M, also built in 91. Unlike its sibling in the lead, 1463 was repainted into BNSF's Heritage 2 paint scheme in 2002. As we were admiring the ex-Burlington Northern Power, a westbound BNSF freight train came by on the CP lines, led by BNSF 7327, a GE ES44DC, and 4821, a GE C44-9W. After the freight train got by, we then went after the ex-Burlington Northern Power. It didn't take too long before we caught back up with the ex-BN Power at the intersection of 21st Street, 7th Avenue, and Unity Boulevard. As soon as the BN train came to a stop, we then saw the signals that were indicating that another train was going to roll on through on the second track. The next train we saw was an eastbound BNSF ethanol train, led by BNSF 6313 and 8586, and acting as DPU power at the rear was 6957. BNSF 6313 is a GE ES44 AC built in 2009. 8586 is a EMD SD70 ACE, and 6957 is a GE ES44 C4. As the ethanol train continued to roll down the tracks, another freight train came on through on Canadian Pacific's river subdivision. After the ethanol train got by, we then tried one more time to go after the Burlington Northern Power, but unfortunately they had gone in too deep into St. Paul Yard, so we couldn't go after them any further. So, knowing about the ethanol train, we decided to try and see that train again, back at the West Point Douglas Road / Belden Boulevard Railroad crossing. Even though we got past the ethanol train, we ended up catching another BNSF freight train as it passed the crossing.
I'm just curious. So, what are you guys filming?
train coming in?
Oh, so you guys just film the train? That's just cool, right? That's pretty fun. This is really slow, though. Did you know where these trains go?
BNSF 5005 is a GE C44-9W built in 2004, and Kansas City Southern 4607 is a GE AC44CW built in 1999. Once the freight train got past, we then made our way back to our hotel in St. Paul to sleep the night, finishing our visit to the city. The next day, we started making our way home, and as part of that route, we decided to follow the Wisconsin side of the Mississippi River, following BNSF's St. Croix Subdivision. The first place we stopped at was in the small town of Pepin, Wisconsin. Located in town along 3rd Street / Great River Road was the historic Pepin Depot. The depot is a small museum which is home to the speeder and other railroad-related artifacts. Unfortunately, at the time of our visit, the museum wasn't open, but if you guys want to visit, according to Travel Wisconsin, the museum is open daily from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. from May to October, and their address is 806 3rd Street, Pepin, Wisconsin. After our stop in Pepin, we then continued on down the river till we reached the famed railfanning hotspot of La Croix, Wisconsin. Here, we drove down to the Amtrak passenger station in town on Canadian Pacific's Tuma Subdivision. The station here was built in 1926 by the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, better known as the Milwaukee Road, and saw many of the road's famed passenger trains, such as the Columbian, the Olympian, and the famed Hiawatha. Just like the day before, using the Amtrak tracker, I saw that the Empire Builder was approaching its La Crosse station stop, so we got set up at the station to watch train number 8 pull in. Leading today's train was Amtrak 203 and 146, both GE P42 DCs, built in 2001. Once the passenger train came to a stop, we then walked to the other side of the station to watch the passenger train pull out. While we were walking down there, I couldn't help but notice that on some of the double-decker Superliner passenger cars, they had different styles of bogies on them. As soon as we made it to the intersection of St. Cloud and Liberty Street, train number 8 blew its horn and began to pull out of La Crosse, Wisconsin, bound for Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and ultimately Chicago. Using this map, although the original Empire Builder did go through La Crosse, Wisconsin, the original train that was operated by the Great Northern Railroad used to use the tracks of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, better known as the Burlington route between the Twin Cities and the Windy City. But when Amtrak was created in 1971 and took over operations of the Empire Builder, it was decided to shift the St. Paul to Chicago run of the Builder from the Burlington route to the Milwaukee Road's Hiawatha route in order to serve Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it has stayed this way ever since. After the Builder left town, we also decided to leave town as well, but before we completely left town, we pulled off of Highway 14/Great River Road and onto 33rd Street, where BNSF's Aurora Subdivision crosses. Here, we saw a westbound BNSF grain train, led by BNSF 8115 and 7805, and acting as DPU power on the rear of the train was BNSF 8385. Besides all the BNSF and ex-Burlington Northern grain cars, there was also an ex-St. Louis-San Francisco Railway grain car, better known as the Frisco Railway, and an ex-Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway grain car on board this train. Both 8115 and 8385 are both GE ES44C4s, and 7805 is a GE ES44DC, built in 2010. the grain train got by, we then got back on the road. The next place we saw a train at was at the Blacktop Road Railroad crossing, just south of Victory, Wisconsin. Here, we saw another grain train waiting on the main line. I hoped that the grain train would pull out when we got there, but we couldn't wait here all day, so we were forced to get back on the road. It wasn't long before we found yet another train. We caught this train at a pull-off along Road 35/Great River Road, south of DeSoto, Wisconsin. The train we saw was an eastbound BNSF freight train, led by BNSF 6792, CSX 5296, and BNSF 3856. Both BNSF 6792 and 3856 are both GE ES44C4s, and CSX 5296 is a GE ES44DC, built in 2005. After the freight train got by, we then decided to give chase to it. That is, until we saw what was headed northbound in Ferryville, Wisconsin. We turned around and caught a westbound local led by BNSF 1922 and 2606 along Great River Road/Road 35. As you can see, BNSF 1922 is a EMD SD40-2, built in 1972 for the Burlington Northern Railroad as their 6339, and just like with BNSF 1458, 1922 still wears its classic Burlington Northern paint scheme. BNSF 2606 is a rebuilt EMD GP39-3. It was built in 1964 for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, originally as an EMD GP35, numbered 1322. It stayed as a GP35 until 1983, when the engine was first rebuilt as a GP35U. The original GP35s had reliability issues as they got older, mainly coming from their wiring, traction motors, and alternators. So, to remedy the problem, the Santa Fe decided to rebuild their fleet of GP35s as GP35Us, rewiring or replacing the wiring systems, refitting the alternators, and replacing the traction motors with more reliable ones found in SD40-2s. The engine stayed as a GP35U all the way into the BNSF era until 2017, when the engine was rebuilt one more time as a GP39-3 and given its current number 2606. After seeing the classic BN power, we then got back on the road and continued south. At Pepin, Wisconsin, we had to leave the river and railroad, as the main road turned away from the Mississippi River, heading east. We then came to a stop in the town of Fenimore, Wisconsin. If you look at a modern railroad map of Wisconsin today, you'll see that Fennimore has no railroads connecting the town. But back in the 1900s, Fennimore was part of a branch line network owned by the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad that stretched from Madison to Fennimore, Lancaster, Platteville, Wisconsin, and Galena, Illinois. Eventually, all these lines were abandoned by the Northwestern in the 1980s and torn up, leaving no traces behind. That is, unless you stop at the Fennimore Railroad Historical Society. At the corner of Lincoln Avenue and 6th Street, the Society operates the Fennimore Railroad Museum, dedicated to preserving the railroad history of the area. The only steam locomotive the museum has here is FRRHS No. 6, a small rebuilt 3-foot gauge 260 tender engine. It was built in 1907 by the Davenport Locomotive Works in Davenport, Iowa, originally as a 044T tank engine for the Gaucho Sugar Company for their sugarcane railroad in Louisiana. There, it pulled sugarcane from the fields to the mills. In 1938, the engine was rebuilt to its current design and given its tender. It stayed with the sugarcane railroad until it was retired in 1959. Eventually, it ended up here on display. Now, I know what some of you may be thinking. Why does this museum own narrow gauge equipment? After all, when you or most other people think of American narrow gauge railroading, often what comes to mind is of the famed Denver and Rio Grande Western in Colorado or the White Pass in Yukon up in Alaska. Well, besides those two well-known examples, many other narrow gauge operations sprang up across the nation, including in the Midwest. Wisconsin in particular had a handful of narrow gauge railroads spring up across the state between 1857 and 1898, as well as some proposed lines that never got built. The reason why they were narrow gauge was to keep construction, maintenance, and operational costs down, as it cost more to do the same thing with standard gauge railroads. The first railroad to reach Fennimore was the Chicago and Tuma Railroad. Being incorporated in 1878, the railroad built a narrow gauge railroad line both north and south from Fennimore to connect Woodman and Lancaster, Wisconsin. In 1879, the C&T then built another line to Montford, Wisconsin, where it connected to another narrow gauge railroad, the Galena and Southern Wisconsin Railroad. There were plans to extend the C&T across the Wisconsin River to Wazeeka and to Gays Mills, Wisconsin, but unfortunately, due to a lack of funds, the line was never built. In 1880, the Chicago and Tuma Railroad was then bought by the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad and was merged into the Galena and Southern Wisconsin Railroad, which was also purchased by the Northwestern that same year. The two narrow gauge railroads were then merged to become the Milwaukee and Madison Railway, and by 1882, the M&M converted most of its existing lines from narrow gauge to standard gauge, with the exception of the line between Fennimore and Woodman, Wisconsin. The reason why that line was not standard gauged was because of the landscape it was built in. The line was built into the Wisconsin River Valley, which is very hilly, and in order to get to Woodman, the line used two horseshoe curves that had a 250-foot radius, far too tight of a curve for standard gauge operations. So, the M&M, and shortly after the Northwestern, continued to use the narrow gauge between Fennimore and Woodman, Wisconsin, all the way up till 1926, when the Northwestern finally abandoned the Fennimore to Woodman line, bringing an end to Northwestern's narrow gauge operations. As of today, besides the museum here, there is no trace of the old narrow gauge railroad lines here. Besides number 6, the museum also owns this ex-Denver and Rio Grande Western boxcar and a speeder, which is the only standard gauge piece of equipment the museum owns. They also have a miniature railway which runs around the property, and they also have the old Fenimore Depot, which houses many of the museum's displays. Unfortunately, the museum and the society does not have a website that you can go check out, but the town website, fenimore.com, does have a section on the society and the museum, which gives information on what the museum is doing and when it's open. So, if you wish to visit the museum, they're located at 610 Lincoln Avenue, Fenimore, Wisconsin. You can go to https://fenimore.com for more information about when the museum is open and what they're doing. I'll leave a link in the description box down below so you can go check it out. After our visit to Fenimore, Wisconsin, our last stop was in East Dubuque, Illinois. Here, we got to watch a BNSF westbound intermodal train pull to a stop at the BNSF East Dubuque Depot. The train was being led by BNSF 8564 and EMD SD70 ACE, 6716 and 6514, both GE ES44C4s. Once the train came to a stop, we then had to get back on the road again as we were trying to get home by the end of the day. And since we had a long way to go before reaching Ohio, this was the last place we stopped at to see trains, bringing an end to this video. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed not only this video, but the others that came before. My dad, brother, and I had a fantastic time on this trip, seeing all the museums, landmarks, and even the big boy, as well as many other things along the way. When the Union Pacific Steam Program announces its next round of excursions for either 4014 or 844, we'll try to get out there to see it. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video as well as the others. I hope you guys have a great day. See you later.